Hello and welcome. Have industrial nations created a climate debt that's a greater threat to our planet than any financial crisis? Developing nations argue that they've been left with the responsibility of paying that debt at the cost of their progress. Well, Copenhagen's UN Climate Change Summit last year was supposed to be a turning point for the world's gathered leaders to set new standards, but they failed to set any binding limits on carbon emissions. Bolivia's President Evo Morales blamed the failure on capitalist countries and announced his own gathering, one that would seek out the voices of activists and those from the developing world. Now the People's World Conference on Climate Change and Mother Earth Rights is underway in Cochabamba. Indigenous representatives, scientists and Hollywood celebrities are hoping the event will mobilize a grassroots effort to shift the debate ahead of the next UN Climate Summit in Mexico. On today's show, we ask, can industrialized nations be trusted to really battle climate change, or is it going to depend on a major grassroots movement? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now to discuss this from the World People's Summit on Climate Change in Cochabamba, Bolivia, is René Orellana, the former Bolivian Minister for Environment and Water Issues. Mr. Orellana is coordinating the working group for this People's Conference. And here in Washington, D.C. is Rob Bradley, Director of Climate Policy at the World Research Institute, the WRI, which provided analysis on climate solutions for the Copenhagen negotiations. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Senor Orellana, I know we have you on the telephone there with us. Let me ask you, sir, why organize a separate event? Why isn't that going to simply split the global effort to try to find some solution to climate change? Why not focus on lobbying the United Nations much harder for the Cancun conference?
Well, first, I would like to say good day for everybody. We have a beautiful morning here, more than 20,000 people participating in this conference. We expected to have around 15,000, but at this moment maybe we want to pass 20,000 people from every part of the world, the 5 continents represented here, social movements, social organizations, regions, some including representatives of different governments that we're going to have their presence here. We're not precisely organizing and realizing a separate event. That's not the idea. We hope that this event, this encounter of social organizations, of citizens of every part of the world, are going to make a proposal for the official events of the United Nations. So that's the point of view we have. This event is producing proposals, documents in different issues related to the discussion we are going to have in the United Nations.
All right, so I'm going to ask you more about those issues in just a moment. Let me bring in here Rob Bradley, who's joining us here in the studio from the WRI. Thanks for being with us as well.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, give me, Rob, your perspective on this gathering in Bolivia. What danger is there this is going to divide the effort or split the effort and the community in trying to find some kind of global solution for climate change?
Well, I think first of all, this conference is doing something immensely important, which is to underscore the incredible urgency of dealing with climate change, the vulnerability of countries and peoples that face up to the impacts of climate change, and to build up a grassroots activism behind it. I think the harsh truth that Copenhagen revealed for many of us is that in many parts of the world, public opinion has not really galvanized enough around taking serious action there. Mm-hmm. In terms of how that then translates into agreements, I do think that it's going to be important to find ways of bringing these conversations back together. Although Copenhagen was very frustrating, it was not without its achievements.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There was a sense of the developing world representatives in Copenhagen were sidelined, and I wonder why more wasn't done to make them feel more invested in the whole process.
I mean, Copenhagen, the meeting, was undeniably a mess, and there were some major problems with the way that smaller groups of negotiators were handled relative to the more inclusive plenary meetings where every country is there. Having said that, in many ways, Copenhagen Accord was negotiated by the largest number of countries ever to negotiate an agreement. The Kyoto Protocol was probably really negotiated by about 7 countries. A fairly representative group of 28 countries drafted the Copenhagen Accord. And so while more can be done to try and improve that inclusiveness, I think that the problem of inclusion was not the fundamental problem in Copenhagen. It was really the underlying political will to take serious action.
Okay, well, I'll get to some more of those potential changes at Cancun. Let me bring back in Senora René Orellana. Senor Orellana, let me ask you to answer a question we had from a viewer from Nigeria who wrote in saying, What issues are the expected issues to be addressed in Cochabamba? I mean, which are the most important issues for you that you want to take to Cancun?
Well, we have a lot of issues, but one of the important issues is precisely to discuss the future of the Kyoto Protocol. The future of the Kyoto Protocol is in risk now, and we do not have to forget that Kyoto Protocol is a legal instrument, a binding legal instrument for everybody in the world. We say that it's in risk because precisely the Copenhagen Accord that has been proposed for 29 countries at the beginning, it says that the commitments of reduction of greenhouse gases is a voluntary commitment. That does not assure the world to have a global commitment of a reduction of greenhouse gases. That's why the protocol or the Kyoto Protocol is not precisely in this context of the Copenhagen Accord, the context of rules that are going to be the basis for making a commitment in the world. I think this is the main problem. The other problem is that we have to make to be conscious that the main problem we have to discuss is precisely this, not the financing that seems to be the central point in the Copenhagen Accord. They have proposed that 2 degrees is going to be the limit of increase of temperature. But nonetheless, the individual commitments the countries made voluntarily on the basis of this Copenhagen Accord does not guarantee that 2 degrees are going to be the increase, but on the contrary, we are very afraid that the increase of the temperature is going to be more than 3 degrees. Okay. The risk of this is very big. We have to be conscious about that.
Of course. So now I'm going to bring back in Rob Bradley here and ask you to answer a question, please, Rob, that came in from Somalia, from a viewer by the name of Mubarak, who says the industrialized countries are not willing to cut their carbon emissions, causing the biggest blow to climate change. I want to add to that there was a leak by the British newspaper, The Guardian in Copenhagen, you probably recall, saying that Denmark had proposed an agreement in secret talks with the US and the UK to try and shift more power to some of the sort of powerful and wealthy countries and knock out the UN's role to some degree. And that Denmark, of course, denied that was any kind of formal draft. But when you have those kind of deals, bilateral and sideline deals being done, what sense of hope does it give the developing countries that they're going to have a voice when the powerful countries can lock in things themselves?
Yeah, well, on that second point, it is perhaps an unhappy fact of international negotiations in every field that powerful countries do strike deals, and that broader agreements sort of start to cohere around those deals. In many ways, the Danish government was not doing something very wrong there. It's kind of the responsibility of a chair of a conference to get together with major parties and try to help them outline the basis of a deal. But certainly that was not a great outcome in the way that it came out. And it does reflect the fundamental question that your first questioner raises, which is that what really underlies this is not the wrong process, it's not the wrong type of meeting, it's not that we're in the wrong venue, it's that in some key countries, political opinion has not been sufficiently galvanized around this idea that we really do need to take the problem seriously and to cut emissions. Obviously, most prominent among those is the United States, where climate legislation is still being contemplated. We certainly hope to still see it, but there's still a lot of uncertainty there. Some other industrialized countries have stepped up somewhat more seriously. The European Union and Japan have set themselves targets that are not meaningless, but there's still a considerable gap between that and what the science is telling us we're going to need in order to hit the 2-degree target that was mentioned earlier.
Let me bring in Senor René Orellana again here, sir, and ask you, there seems to be some understanding, some acceptance by those planning the conference in Cancun that nothing major can be achieved in one go, that there needs to be steps. And one of those steps is to prioritize certain issues, which it sounds like will benefit the developing nations. Do you have some hope that the prioritizing of issues that's being discussed will help countries like yours and other developing countries?
Well, it would be a pity for the world if developed countries consider that Mexico is not going to be an ideal scenario to make important commitments in order to reduce greenhouse gases. We really think that this is the main point. Of course, there are another issues that must be discussed related to adaptation or resilience, related to financing, transfer of technology, etc. But the main point, and that is why the world is worried, is the increase of temperature. And we cannot wait for another year, 2011, till South Africa, December next year, to make this commitment. We hope that the message that is going to be put on the table by this conference is precisely to be all the countries on the table in order to discuss in the context of the United Nations a commitment, a really good commitment in order to reduce greenhouse gases, in order to contribute to the planet, to a good environment in the planet. The proposals we are proposing here, we're building here, are going to be put probably by a submission in the context of the United Nations. We are not dividing the world. We have here the presence also of different parts of the developed countries, citizens, civil society members that are also worried about what is happening in their own countries. So we think that this conference is not precisely only of developing countries, but of the world.
Okay. Now I'll bring in Rob Bradley again here. It's an interesting point that Minister Orellana makes, that there needs to be that more inclusive approach to the next talks. Let me ask you though your view on what Norway's Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg says, that to include so much in one set of talks, from deforestation prevention to technology transfer to emissions targets, is too much, and there has to be a sense of stepping it. Can it work? I mean, Copenhagen was supposed to be this all-inclusive final chance to fix everything, but it seems now everything's going to have to be staggered.
Yeah, climate change has long suffered from the problem that it's too political for the technocrats and way too technical for the politicians. And part of the problem and the meltdown in Copenhagen was that normally heads of state turn up for a handshake and a photo op on a deal that's already been put in place, or at the very least negotiate around a couple of big options. Instead, they turned up and more or less handed a blank sheet of paper and asked to draft a treaty, which many of them were simply not prepared or willing to do. So I think that question of whether we can move on some things without holding them hostage to the overall deal is an important one. I would stress that Copenhagen didn't achieve nothing. In fact, it did achieve a whole set of commitments which countries have since reiterated, including all the major economies. They're not enough, but they are substantial. And so the two questions we have to ask ourselves are, how does the process help those countries, make them more likely to implement what they said they were going to do, and how do we move those countries quickly to increase the ambition of what they're prepared to commit to? I think holding that process up hostage to the broader questions about the legality of the agreement would be a pity.
I'm going to ask you gentlemen to stand by, because we're going to take a very short break here. Back with more of our discussion in just a moment. Welcome back. We're discussing an alternative climate summit being organized in Bolivia in response to criticism by some developing nations that the UN summit in Copenhagen last year failed them. With me is René Orellana, who is coordinating the working groups for the World's People's Summit on Climate Change in Cochabamba in Bolivia, and Rob Bradley, Director of Climate Policy at the World Research Institute here in DC, which was heavily organized in last year's Copenhagen negotiations. Senor Orellana is joining us by the phone. And Senor Orellana, if I could get back to you and ask you, your country has lost a lot of significant economic aid, because you wouldn't endorse Copenhagen. I was wondering, was it worth it?
Yes, that's a pity. We have recently received the information that some countries have decided to retire the finance for the cooperation for financial project here in Bolivia, and we think that's not precisely a good way to react to the position Bolivia had in the last conference in Copenhagen. Not only Bolivia, but Ecuador, etc. We think that developed countries, particularly they who are proposing the Copenhagen Accord, have to think objectively with a cold mind, let's say that we need a discussion. The way they try to impose the document that they call the Copenhagen Accord in the Denmark and the Copenhagen event was not precisely a democratic way to discuss an issue that we've been discussing in different groups in the context of the United Nations the last 2 years. They gave us 1 hour to read and approve a document that they had the time to write in 1 or 2 days. And that was not the way to make us to think the solutions for our planet, particularly related to the reduction of greenhouse gases. We have to make a discussion in the context of the United States, in the context of the democratic rules, and that's what we expect in December in Mexico, and of course with proposals. We hope the proposals we're going to have from this conference, international or world conference, are going to be presented in a juridical way, respecting, of course, the rules of the United Nations.
Okay, Rob Bradley, interesting points that the former minister is making there, but there's also this issue of climate debt that keeps being raised now, the idea that the developed world, industrialized nations, have created a climate debt that now the developing nations are having to pay, in effect. Explain your views on that concept, the idea that there is an outstanding debt to the developing world.
Yeah, well, in concept, it's clearly right that there is damage being felt by developing countries now, which largely unintentionally was caused by the industrialization path that today's rich countries have followed. You can argue endlessly about where blame attaches, to what extent that was conscious or accidental, and certainly calculating it in any rigorous way is virtually impossible. But I think it really underscores morally the importance of providing support, in particular for the poorest and most vulnerable countries, to deal with the impacts of climate change. That's on the agenda, but developed countries have not shown nearly enough willingness so far to actually put together those funds. Again, Copenhagen did achieve something on this. So there was an announcement that $100 billion a year of funding will collectively be provided by the industrialized countries by the time we get to 2020 and maintained over time. Many people will argue that that's still not enough. It's a fairly big step change from where we are. So again, rather than rejecting Copenhagen and calling it a failure, it would be good to think in terms of how do you actually solidify that, ensure that it's delivered, and then build on it in ambition over time.
Senor Orellana, how do you feel about the efforts being made to try to address the issue of climate debt, and that the developed world, the industrialized nations, now recognize there is some kind of debt owed in effect to the developing world?
Well, precisely one of the issues of one of the 17 groups is the climate debt. You know that 76% of the global emissions of greenhouse gases has been made by industrialized countries, the richest countries of the world, the developed countries, and they have 20% of the population of the world. The rest of the countries of the world, we also hope to have a development, of course, in a different way, with clean energy, etc., not producing that impact on the environment. But the rest of the world are not in the possibility to develop in the same conditions. The atmosphere is full of gases. We cannot contribute to generate the same problem they generated. And our opportunities of development has been in that way cut. Mm-hmm. So that they have climate debt that is composed of an adaptation debt, Mother Earth debt also. There's a debt with Mother Earth because this process of generating greenhouse gases has had an impact on nature, on Mother Earth. That's another thing we are discussing here. Right. And this must be discussed in different contexts. One of them is related to financing adaptation, transferring technology, which is an obligation developed countries have, and that is set by the Convention of United Nations related to climate change. It's not precisely a proposal we're making today. They have signed a convention in United Nations that says exactly that, right. The obligation, the commitment of transferring financing and technology.
Well, listen, I want to ask Rob Bradley, this issue now that the former ministers raised about the developing world having their opportunities to grow cut. It's obviously an argument that's raised a lot. A question that came in by email from a regular viewer, Barnabas Mulhuti, who wrote in saying, there won't be a way out of this mess. China and many emerging economies can't obtain sound economic development while sustaining the environment. Those countries like China, India, Brazil, now also these sort of powerful growing nations, they're going to have a bigger voice. How do you expect them to tilt the balance when it comes to the meeting at Cancun, for example?
Well, in many ways, although we've referred throughout this conversation to industrialized countries, it's a confluence of interests or of approach, if you like, between players like the United States and players like China that have left smaller developing countries to a certain extent in the margins. The big question, of course, the question of all questions is, can all of the world's countries find a way of developing that is not going to imperil the climate? And there are some signs that give us some hope. Certainly China is amongst those, and certainly India is amongst those that are pouring investment into renewable energies and other low carbon technologies on a scale which matches or surpasses those of the industrialized countries. The World Bank put out a report just last week suggesting that all of the East Asian countries could in fact stabilize their emissions within the next decade or so, while maintaining growth on the path needed to pull their people out of poverty, and that's a step in the right direction. Again, there's still a shortfall, and there's an urgency here that is still not being met. But the signs are that it can be done and that we can find a way. It's hard to predict those things.
Minister Orellana, we have about 30 seconds, I'm afraid, but I want to get your perspective on how much you expect to come out of your conference in Bolivia and how much you'll be able to take with you to Cancun, please.
Well, first of all, we have to follow an article that is established in the Convention of the United Nations about climate change, which is related to the historical responsibility in the emission of greenhouse gases.
Okay.
There is a group of countries that has an historical responsibility, and that historical responsibility has been determined by sciences. It is not precisely a political point of view. Okay. And there's a group of countries which are listed in the Annex 1, and they have the responsibility. Of course, emerging countries.
I'm sorry, sir. I only have to stop you there because we're so out of time, unfortunately. But Rob Bradley, I want to thank you, Minister, as well. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us too. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us feedback on the topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, is the Obama administration changing its approach to Iran and seriously considering a military response to the nuclear program there? Join us for that. See you next time.